Just a round of applause. Enjoy, man.
Cheers. Wow. Well, thank you for being eye candy. I don't think I've been offered that before as an honorarium. It's good to be here, and it's good to be here really at this moment. And what to many people seems like a moment of quite an amount of significant cultural turmoil, not just in this country, but in the world, is also a moment which I think we need to reframe and look at differently. If you look at when the church expands, there's a pattern. And I don't just mean one church growing. I don't just mean a church getting stronger in terms of more programs. But if you look throughout history at the different times when the church has been renewed, when it's been revived, when it's done surprising things, when the Holy Spirit's come and changed people, it's actually at these moments of cultural crisis. It's a cliche, but it's true that the Chinese character for crisis also means opportunity. And there's this sense that at a point in time when many people are feeling a sense of fear, often what that fear is actually about is a fear of losing control. It's funny that most of us are probably more afraid of going on an international jetliner than we are in driving. The odds are that you have a 1 in 5,000 chance of being killed in a car accident and a 1 in 11 million chance of being killed in a plane accident. I think it was in 2016, there wasn't a large plane crash in the entire world. Yet we don't read of all of the individual stories of car accidents. If one touches you personally, you understand that. But we don't put them on the news. Yet if a 747 goes down, it's reported everywhere. And part of the reason is that we prefer to go in the car. And I know people who are terrified of getting on a jetliner, but then they'll drive to the airport. It's bizarre. But part of the reason is, you think about it, the reason that we're more afraid of the jet is we sit there and we can't see the pilot. Are they on drugs? Who are they? You hear this little like, hello, I'll be your pilot. I don't know you. Like, who are you? But we're in the car. We have this myth that we can somehow grab the wheel. Even in the passenger seat, that we could, reach for the handbrake. And so we're at a moment where many of the things that have been constant for 30 years, the idea that the world will just keep progressing, that the West will stay on top, that maybe America will continue to be the #1 country in the world, that the myth that we've been given that we just need to buy the right stuff and buy the right experiences and somehow we'll have this happy life. All of that's being tested now. Paul talks about the humiliation of the powers and principalities. Powers and principalities are one of those things you get to often in the New Testament, and we don't really know what they are. But this sense that behind human institutions, there's actual spiritual forces. And that behind these things which move our culture, behind these things that actually on the cross, Paul says in Colossians that those powers and principalities were humiliated. Now we're seeing that in our time. Politics is being humiliated. Politicians' trust is rock bottom. Your country's been in political turmoil, but the whole world's been in political turmoil. There's countries in Africa in political turmoil. There's countries in South America in political turmoil. Iceland's got a pirate party running it at the moment. The world has gone into these spasms of change at this time. Silicon Valley, which people look to as the answer to solve politics. I have books in my garage saying that politics will be solved. This is written in the early 90s. Politics will be solved by this thing called the internet. And everyone's just going to get connected, and totalitarian regimes will fall, and like all the dictators will fall, and the people will rise up, and it's just going to be a giant sort of Matrix-inspired rave. And you read these things now, and it's just ridiculous. That what we see is that Silicon Valley and technology is an answer is being humiliated. Big business was humiliated during the global financial crisis. Hollywood's being humiliated. All across the world, the institutions that we look to, that we saw as paragons of virtue, are being shown up. Not as exciting, but the Panama Papers, the revelation of the actual expenditure of some of the world's most powerful people. It didn't get as much news because it's not as sexy and it's not as, it doesn't grab the news about a Harvey Weinstein or something. But when you read those reports, you saw that these people that people look to all across the world, presidents and kings and influencers, are lining their pockets. In Brazil, the biggest ever financial stealing ever in human history with the Petrobras scandal. So across the world, at this time and place, the life that you're living intersects with the reality that you're living in a time in which the powers and principalities and empire and corporations and our media and our images and our mental maps and our myths are being humiliated in a way never seen before. Now, Leslie Newbigin, who was a bishop in South India, in 1960 wrote a book called Honest Religion for Secular Man. And it's really interesting. He predicted that what would happen is that secularism would go through these stages. And you have this time in secularism where it would sort of almost go well, where there'd be this incredible freedom. But then he said after a while, people would actually begin to yearn again for meaning. Because consumerism couldn't fill that hole. Life without God needs to be filled by something. And for a long time there, particularly since about 1989 till really about 2 years ago, we thought that people could be happy by just giving them a better phone every couple of years. It was the period, like in the early 2010s, I call it the Paris Hilton period, where it just seems like you just more experiences, more stuff, and everyone will be happy. Well, it didn't work like that. Because we as humans have a God-shaped hole. We have an emptiness inside of us. Our hearts do not find rest until they find rest in God. So when we don't look for God, we look for other, stronger forms of magic than buying stuff. Politics gets crazy. Tribalism returns. Nationalism returns. People begin to look to the old myths that we thought were dead in the mid-century of the 20th. But now these things are coming back, and this is the time in which you live. So Newbigin said, what if Christ weirdly is using secularism against itself? To expose all things that people may put their trust in and allowing everything to fall and everything to be humiliated except for anything but God's glory. The only thing that you can rely on. And so you live at that moment. But the story that you've been told is that actually your own little journey, your own personal story that you're writing, that you're constructing this mini movie of your life. And that's a story that is also beginning to fall down at this point in time. That's a story which increasingly we're seeing is not delivering us happiness. There's this really bad 80s movie with John Travolta called The Experts. Has anyone seen it? Like 1986? No one. I've asked this in multiple forums. No one's seen it, all right? You can get it on Apple iTunes Store. You know.
Should we?
No, don't. It's rubbish. And the premise of the movie is that, and this is based on a true fact, that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had these fake American towns. And these fake American towns where they would send their KGB spies to learn American culture and see if they could sort of survive undercover. So in this movie, what happens is they've got this fake American town somewhere in like Siberia or something. And the problem is, though, it's like out of date. So it's the 1980s, mid-1980s, things are happening, and the town's stuck in the 50s. It's like Leave It to Beaver world. It's like a Norman Rockwell painting. And so the KGB have this problem, like when they send spies there, they sort of turn up as like squares in America. Ridiculous movie premise. But anyway, stay with me. So the KGB's plan is to abduct some cool people from America. So they go to New York and the KGB abduct John Travolta, who's a nightclub owner, and his friend, who's an 80s cool guy. I don't even remember his name. This is how B-grade this movie is. And then they bring them to this town, but they don't realize that they've actually left America. They think they've gone to some Midwest, like, square town. And so it's fascinating in this movie that they start this nightclub, but it's really bad and no one's dancing. But then there's there's two transformational moments for this fake American town. The first one is they're afraid that John Travolta will leave the town because it's just so boring. So they send in their KGB Red Sparrow, agent seductress, Kelly Preston. This is where they met, by the way, if you're into Hollywood trivia. And they send her in so that she'll keep his interest and keep him there. So she rocks up to the nightclub and she's got the 80s permed hair. And they can only do what is described as a strange 80s sexy dance. But this has this incredible effect on the town. All of a sudden, people are winking at each other, nudging each other, and it's like the sexual revolution happens during a John Travolta dance. And the town all of a sudden is awakened, and no longer are they sort of as square and 50s. And so they're halfway there to being cool. But then the second bit happens when John Travolta says to the KGB handler, he says, what they need is they need gadgets. They need things. If they really want to become Americans, they need consumerism. So the KGB come and they just buy all this American stuff. It's like 80s, so it's like these stereos and there's like Walkmans and there's like little remote-controlled robots and like cool 80s glasses. And they just let it loose in the town. Now what happens is, the town then, that's the breakthrough point. All of a sudden, they all decide, they realize that they're in the Soviet Union, and the entire town breaks out, jumps on a plane, and migrates to America. So the message of that movie, a stupid movie sometimes actually say the strongest points. Don't watch it. I just gave away the whole thing. You don't need to see it now. The point of the movie was really the myth of our culture. You just need pleasure, sexual freedom, more stuff, and that's the road to nirvana. That's the road to nirvana that even people in communist countries will want to leave and come because this is the most powerful story in the world. Now, that was like phase 1 of freedom. But we're now in phase 2, where that's just as increased. We've got more stuff than in 1985. The gadgets that we have at our fingertips would blow 85 John Travolta's mind. The freedom that we have is more. We've moved from the age of Kelly Preston and John Travolta doing a slightly risque dance to the age of Tinder and pornography is normal. And are we happier? No, the stats are that we're sadder. We're more isolated. We're more alone. We're more anxious. We're going through a mental health crisis. And actually, it doesn't make sense if you read that through the metrics of the last age, because everything that we're experiencing doesn't make sense according to the story that we've been told. Because we're told if you have great experiences, more stuff, you're going to be happy. But we're not happy. And so we're now living at this point where the gods of the age are being pulled down. And so what this means is that a certain form of Christianity that's been lived and has sort of existed for some time is also coming under a form of judgment. So the powers are pulled down, and sometimes the flesh in the church that appears like the church, but it's actually human flesh in the church, is also one of those powers which is actually resisting the advance of the gospel. And so what happens is this form of Christianity, cultural Christianity, is coming under tremendous pressure. And that can look like a decline in the church. And that can look like, and it looks like in Australia, where my denomination is shutting churches left, right, and centre. There's not going to be many churches left in the next 10 years. That's happening in Europe. And that's been happening for some time in Australia and Europe and these places. But now it's beginning to come here. And the American church in many places is freaking out. But I want to say, what if we reframe that and we look at that not as a decline in the church, but a decline in cultural Christianity? And what cultural Christianity was, that the culture seemed to be part Christian, but then it wasn't. And what you could do in cultural Christianity is actually have a foot in the world, but a foot in the church. You could pursue the life script of the culture, more stuff, more things, more pleasure, but you could coat it in a veneer, a varnish, a lacquer of Christianity, and seemingly hit both bullseyes with one arrow. And what's happening is that's no longer the case. To look at this, I just want to just open the scriptures. If you do have your Bibles, Bible apps, Torah scrolls, whatever you carry. We're actually going to look at 1 Kings chapter 9. And what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit of a model of what it looks like to live fully for God when cultural Christianity is dying and you're looking for a different way. Because in praying, my original plan when I got up this morning was I was jet lagged, not feeling well. I had 3 services, 2 at Garden Church in Long Beach, 1 here. And I was just going to do the same sermon. What's happened today is that this is the 3rd different sermon because every time God said he wants something different. And I really felt today, coming here, that actually what God wants to do is move some of you from something that you're living that you think is culture, that you think is Christianity, but actually is a lot of cultural Christianity. And what he wants to do is he actually wants to introduce you to something which is living and vibrant and more expansive and more flourishing than any concepts of Christianity that you brought here today. So it's actually a landmark moment for some of you. I really believe that. So let's start. 1 Kings 9, 1 Kings 9. Let's start at number 1. Just to set this up. What's happened is, this is King Solomon. King Solomon, who is endlessly praised in this book. But what's really interesting is when you read this book, Solomon is praised as wise. He builds an incredible temple. He's got all these wives, and they just keep talking about how wonderful he is. But then there's this sort of backbeat, this murmur in the background, a second story going on. That if you look at what he's doing, he's making compromises. There's disobedience. Moses, who leads the people out of Egypt, Mizraim, this place of bondage and slavery. And it says, Solomon's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And he marries Pharaoh's daughter. The tabernacle, which God asked Moses to build, which wasn't flash. It looked something like this, like a bunch of tents and a bit of fabric out in the middle of nowhere. Wasn't impressive, yet was filled with the glory of God. Like God's living presence was there, pure and unadulterated. Solomon builds a temple, and we'll discover in a second that the Spirit of God is there. But then there's this weird thing, is he building this for the Spirit of God? Yeah, he is, but he's also building it for his own glory. And so in some ways, Solomon speaks to us because I know I'm in the Old Testament, and this is it doesn't make sense historically, but he's almost like a proto-cultural Christian. He wants God's glory, but he also wants his own. He builds a temple, and people think, what a hero, he's built the temple, but he also builds a palace complex that's bigger than the temple. He has a foot in both camps. God's glory, but my glory. So, let's read from 1. When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all that he desired to do, and this is one of those little things. Okay, he's done everything he wanted to do. He's done everything he wanted to do. Moses is a man after God's heart. Moses does what God wants to do. Solomon is amazing. He's a superstar, but he's doing what he wants to do. The Lord appeared to him a second time. So sometimes God's actually going to turn up with people who are conflicted. And he's going to give them a chance. As he appeared to him at Gibeon, and the Lord said to him, so what's happening here? He's set this temple up. He's asking for the Spirit to come, and the Spirit comes. The Spirit of God comes in fullness, just as it did to the tabernacle. But it's almost a but. So if you imagine the Shekinah glory of God's rocked up, and he's like, just before I come into this temple, I just want to make a few things clear. I've heard the prayer, this is God speaking, and plea you have made before me. I've consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But, this is a big but, if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you, and then go off and serve other gods and worship them, which he already was doing, then I will cut off Israel from the land I've given them, and I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among the people. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass will be appalled and scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshipping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought this disaster upon them. See, a temple, we had this concept of two types of temples. We have this concept of a temple that's pure, where it's being fully worshipped as God intends it, where people are in relationship with him, where there's this covenant with him, where there's obedience. And then we've got this other idea of like a pagan temple, which is totally worshipping other gods. But what's really interesting, this is a conflicted temple. This is a contested temple. This is a temple with one foot in the world and one foot in heaven. This is a temple that wants it both ways. And it reflects the heart of the builder, Solomon. He wants it both. That's some of us. And what that means is we're going to build our own creations and our own structures. And I don't mean necessarily buildings. But we'll build lives and life scripts and relationships and careers and creative endeavors and habits that actually will be partially Christian, but then partially glory seeking for ourselves. Where we root our identity, a bit in the Grace, Jesus saved for me, amazing grace. I can sing that. But I also want some glory for myself. Because my identity is fixed in what I've been told by the world about myself. And so what this is calling the people of God to is God's telling them, I'm going to dwell here because God still wants to dwell and he wants to come, but he asks obedience. When we jump forward to, you don't have to turn there, but in Mark 13, verse 1, it's really interesting. Jesus is at the temple and he's there with his disciples. Now, this is not Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple gets destroyed, which is a sign of what we just read, that he wasn't obedient. Now, it gets even worse because this is now Herod's temple. Herod makes Solomon look awesome. Herod is totally sold out to the globalization of his day, all the Roman Greek ideas. He's just a guy who just is partially just with his little toenail following God, and the rest of him is given over to the other gods. And so Jesus is there, and he's with some of his guys who are boys from the bush. They're from the countryside. These are guys who've never seen the big city. And they're impressed. Verse 13, verse 1. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones. What a magnificent building." He's impressed by the building blocks of the world. The building blocks of glory. The building blocks of Herod's temple. And you would expect Jesus, the religious guy, the rabbi, to go, absolutely, this is the temple. This is where all of the world's meant to come to. Jerusalem, all the nations are going to bow here. Let's just get the whole thing around this. Because that's where people thought it was going. But then Jesus says this, do you see, awesome, that was like more of that, please. Do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. You read that. That is just utterly mind-blowing to a first century Jew. Absolutely. The temple was the navel of the universe. It was literally where God was going to come back to. Ezekiel talked about the Shekinah glory of God leaving the temple, and their prayers prayed night after night after night. The people who tried to overthrow the Romans with military force, the people who went out into the desert to pray and fast and take vows, all of them ever wanted was that glory to return to the temple. The temple has had its glory return. It's in a skinny 30-something from Nazareth, walking around that no one noticed because he didn't look like the visions of grandeur that they expected, because they were looking with earthly eyes. Here is this young guy, and he's returned to the temple, and he looks at the temple and says, big rocks don't impress me. They don't impress God, and they shouldn't impress you. Because what I'm actually doing is, this thing is now over. This thing is functionally here, but it's functionally dead. And in a few years, and what happened in 70 AD when the Roman general Vespasian came in and destroyed the temple, it's never been rebuilt. On top of it now is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and ain't nobody building there. That's just going to trigger World War III if anyone tries to build a temple there. That is there now, but it's actually not meant to come back. Because what we're meant to be now is we're meant to be a different kind of temple. See, the temple in the Old Testament was this place where what Israel could do is they could be physically proximate and close to their neighbors. So that all these different nations around them, they call them the Goyim, which has got a little of a slight of a dig in it. Like the Goyim, it's the nations, but it's a bit of a dig at them. And the Goyim were near, and they could trade with them and be friends with them, and they could relate to them and learn from them, but they couldn't be like them. So they were called at the temple, like they would go and they would trade with Romans, and they were trading with all these different, it was a globalized world. Israel's like this land bridge between Europe and Africa and Asia. So it was all different people coming through. So they could trade and talk to them, but then they had worshipping distance. They would then go to the temple or the synagogue and they would have worshipping distance. So they were physically close, but worshipping distance. And that's been the strategy of the church. Be here. Be here in Newport Beach. Like, go to the places where people eat. And what we'll do is we'll then give you a church, which is sort of like the world with cool music, but enables you to have worshipping distance. And for some time, that actually worked. I don't want to completely critique that model. That has worked for decades. But what's really interesting is that times of cultural chaos, times of change, times of globalization like we're living in now, is that there is a kind of influence which comes into almost our inside mind that's not about being physically close, that we live in this hyper-connected moments where we're being shaped on the inside in ways that people have never been shaped before in history. There is a profile of you, particularly if you're under 35, there is a profile of you following your internet profile, the consumer choices you make, somewhere in a mainframe in Silicon Valley. It knows stuff about you that your closest friends don't know. It knows every internet search you've ever made, every word you've ever put into an email. I was talking to my friend who's in advertising in Europe, and he just came back from a conference where they talked about this, and he just said, I can't tell you what they know about you, but be very, very afraid. What's so interesting is that they actually know what you're feeling at certain times of the day. Recently in elections, what they've been doing around the world is they now do emotional targeting. So what this means is some of this technology that was originally used for advertising, and there was a stage like in the early 2000s where in New York, brain researchers couldn't get access to certain medical equipment for imaging the brain because the ad agencies were using it all. So they now understand how your brain works possibly better than you. So what was happening in political campaigns, or is happening now, is they know, according to your internet searches, how often you look at your phone, the words that you say, when you're most anxious in the day. They will then send you a targeted Facebook message, Twitter message, Instagram message, with a political message that makes you afraid. It's not sensical. It's to go beyond your rational brain into your deep fears. And they can target you with that message. That company can send you that food advertisement. Why did they send it to me when I was hungry? I had this experience like the other day. I was on the phone to my publisher who's over here, and we're having this conversation. He says, I'm almost going to come all the way to Australia. He's in Chicago. I'm almost coming down to Australia. I'm coming to Singapore. I said, I love Singapore. Singapore's great. He said, I've always wanted to go to Singapore. And we said Singapore a lot. 20 minutes later, banner ads. Cheap flights to Singapore, Raffles Hotel, Singapore noodles. What the heck is going on? So you have this ability. And the myth that we've been told, because the 80s myth with John Travolta, where you just had to get up in a nightclub and dance like you've never danced before and wear whatever clothes you wanted to wear and buy stuff, was that you were a spontaneous, free individual. You're actually not. Humans are told that we're spontaneous, free, radical individuals, and you're very original and you don't think like other people. But how we're treated in reality is you're herd like animals. And they know exactly what you feel. And they can move and get you to sell and buy stuff. And we're now hooked in. Tom McCarthy, the artist, did a thing. I think it was in, I can't remember where, Eastern Europe somewhere, did an art show. And what he had is he had people come to the art show and he wanted them to have this installation where they would sign over their freedom. So what he did is he got a bunch of people and he's going to dress them up as like sort of, Eastern European communist spies, and they had leather jackets, and they were going to get people to come in and sign their souls away and their freedom as they entered the art show. And if you didn't sign up, you weren't allowed to enter the art show. But then he had this realization like, hang on, that's not how it would work today. So he got a bunch of people to actually dress like Apple employees. And he got rid of all the angry Eastern European looking guys, and he got really smiling, cute sort of millennials, and they smiled at people and said, hi, would you like to sell your soul? And people are like, no worries, I'll sell my soul here. Because the weird thing is we're actually giving away our freedom at the moment, that inner life that we have. So you're being formed in this profound way. So the old model where, yes, you were around people in proximity, but you had worshipping distance, is now being completely undone, because our worship space is not just where we worship God, but our worship space is wherever we point our desires. It's the ache of our hearts. And now we have people who have the ability to shape that, and your desires, which may feel like they're there and key, are actually being shaped and are currently being hijacked by other people. And that undermines any models of church and influence and discipleship that we've had before. This scenario has never existed before. So we actually need a different way. Yes, we need worshipping distance from the culture and the idols that it worships. The weird thing is that we're physically proximate to people, but we actually need to get closer to them. This is radically countercultural in a time where people are increasingly eating alone. What you just did, eating together in the Uber Eats age, is actually a prophetic sign. Some of you sitting and just hugged someone you didn't know, you just ate with someone you didn't know. That is so counterculturally radical in 21st century America to actually go in an opposite direction and actually build community. So we're actually becoming, we're not even physically proximate to people anymore. The number one household that is emerging across the West is a single person living alone. There's parts of Scandinavia now where it's like 56% of the population. South Korea and Japan now have government welfare programs for the fact that most people will live and die alone. So what you're actually doing here is something quite radical. So what we need to be physically close to those who are our neighbors, not just the people who like the same stuff as us, but the people who are on our streets, who may be very different to us and in a very different socioeconomic age. We need to be close to the people around us. We need to have worshipping distance. But we also need something in this hyper-connected world, which is formational distance from the world. The world is deforming you in ways unknown in human history. In the past, you could go Amish and go off the grid and just hang out in your neighborhood and go to the Christian basketball comp and go to the Christian bookstore and go to the Christian interior decorating store and go to the Christian dating site and go to the Christian bookstore and do all that stuff. You can't do that anymore in the same way because it can reach into you. So at this time in history, cultural Christianity is having the rug pulled out from under it, but we have a possibility of a new reality of people who say, I'm not going to be formed in these ways anymore. I'm actually going to take a proactive stance, and instead of being on defense at the world's influence, I'm actually going to go on offense, and I'm actually going to partner with God in creating a new life architecture in my life. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take apart my life, and I'm going to look at all the different ways I'm formed. Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. And most of us wake up and look at our phones. At our church, we have a little hashtag, mantra, whatever you want to call it, win the day. And what that means is we just got real practical and said, put your phone at the other end of the house. Buy an alarm clock. A bunch of people went and bought alarm clocks from Target. And wake, and you be proactive in how you're going to spend your day. Come up with a plan. Write 5 things that you want to do that day. Who needs an encouragement from me? Who needs my presence? Actually, I'm going to pray about that meeting. I'm actually going to ask the Holy Spirit to come into that day. I need to spend time and ring my dad because I haven't spoken to him for a while. I need to have that word of encouragement. I'm going to go into my workplace, not anxious, but ask the Spirit to come. Give me his peace. And what this means is that the problem is, at any moment like this, where all of you have the potential to be influential, all of you have in your pockets these devices which are forming us, but also allow us to form other people. The people at moments who are most likely to be influential are also those most likely to be influenced. Henry Kissinger, in his book on China, talks about that the ports in the south of China are the ones which have influenced the world the most. If you meet Chinese people in Melbourne, they're almost all from southern China. There is a Chinatown that's been there for 100 years. You go around the world, it's amazing how many Chinatowns that you will discover. Chinese culture has influenced the globe and is influencing it more. So much of that actually comes from southern Chinese ports. Now, what's really interesting is that's been super influential, that culture, but also that's the places where China was influenced. That's where the opium trade come in. That's actually where they were influenced and colonized, and at some point the West took over some of those ports. So the people and places that are placed to be most influential are also the ones that are most influenced. So what we need at this time, when renewal and revival happens, is when people who are posited by God in influential positions are no longer influenced by the world. They are influenced by God. So at this time, there's a choice to be made. Go on offense. Choose not to have a foot in the world and a foot in the church. Don't be a contested, conflicted temple. Because actually, you know what? You're actually a temple. When that thing fell in Jerusalem, you know what it was replaced by? First of all, it was replaced by Jesus is a temple. Second, it was replaced by this, the living temple of the people of God. This is not just a bunch of people getting together eating Mexican. This is actually the new temple. And we don't have amazing rocks around us. We could be doing this in a park. We could be doing this anywhere in a house. We could do it in a cathedral. It's not about the building. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am. We hear that and go, that's a nice little thing when there's not many people turn up to your church service. What that's actually saying is the Shekinah glory of God that existed in the holiest of holies is there when just 2 or 3 of you pray. That can happen in your car. That can happen on a commute. That can happen tonight when you go home. And so actually what we're in the business now of, you're also a living temple. In 1 Corinthians 6, it says your body is a living temple. So become a temple builder. See yourself as actually God's plan to send his temple to the ends of the earth, because the temple is the carrier of his presence. Beautiful. So what we need to move from being influenced to actually being influential. And you do that by rechanging the life architecture of your life, your patterns of worship, you mini temple. You're a mini temple with your own liturgy, your own practices. Reorientate them away from things which are serving the big business interests of shareholders in some company somewhere to actually serving the one true living God. That is a model for a different kind of Christianity. That's a model for a renaissance in the church in the United States. So what if cultural Christianity fades? It was rubbish to begin with. What we actually need is a small, hardened, renewal remnant. Beautiful. Because remnants are always used by God, and it doesn't matter how small they are. What it matters is how big their faith is in God. So start to fill yourself with his presence. He wants to do something, but that begins with a decision. And the decision to make is, am I going to just keep chasing the world's dreams? Or am I going to give up the charade as we begin to see it shatter and shudder and fall, and the masonry falling off the buildings of the institutions of the world, and put my trust in him who was in the tabernacle, in the burning bush, in the temple. He was there in Jerusalem, and he's in you. Turn your home into a temple. Turn your friendships into a temple. Turn this into a temple filled with the living presence of God. That's his plan. What we're going to do is let's stand, and I'm going to pray.